There are black Iranians who have lived in Iran for over 1,000 years. They speak Farsi fluently, practice Shia Islam, fight in the Iranian military, and still get asked by fellow Iranians where they are really from. Their history has been scrubbed from school textbooks. Their ancestors were bought and sold in Iranian bazaars for centuries, and the country formally abolished slavery only in 1929. Most Iranians today will tell you Iran never had a slavery problem. Many have never heard of the Afro-Iranian community at all. And every single year, during the most celebrated national holiday in Iran, a blackface character dances through the streets of every Iranian city, and millions of people who pass him see absolutely nothing wrong with that. This is the story of the Afro-Iranian community, one of the most invisible and least understood minority groups in the entire Middle East. To understand how they got here, you have to go back to the Indian Ocean slave trade, which is a chapter of history that receives a fraction of the attention given to the transatlantic trade, but moved comparable numbers of people across comparable distances over a comparable span of centuries. Arab slave traders operating along the East African coast in what is now Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Ethiopia captured and transported enslaved Africans northward across the Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf and beyond. Enslaved people were sold into Iran, Egypt, Arabia, India, and the Far East over a period stretching from the 9th century well into the 20th. By the 19th century, under the Qajar and Safavid dynasties, the traffic had intensified significantly. Wealthy Persian households employed African slaves in aristocratic homes for domestic labor, as concubines, and as entertainers. Women and children were particularly vulnerable. The trade continued for so long and at such scale that virtually every country bordering the Persian Gulf today has a legacy black population descended from it, including Afro-Iraqis, Afro-Kuwaitis, Afro-Omanis, Afro-Saudis, and the Afro-Iranians. In 1848, under significant British pressure, Muhammad Shah Qajar signed a decree officially banning the maritime slave trade. But slavery itself continued in practice for decades after that, and was not formally abolished in Iran until 1929. That date is important because it is within living memory of people who are still alive today. And here is the part that historian Bita Baghulizadeh, a Princeton-affiliated scholar and author of the landmark 2024 book, The Color Black, Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, documents in forensic detail. After abolition came not reckoning, but erasure. The Iranian state did not acknowledge its history of slavery. It did not document the communities of formerly enslaved people and their descendants scattered across the southern coast. It did not integrate that history into national education. Instead, it simply acted as if slavery had never happened, and by acting that way persistently and officially for long enough, it produced exactly the collective amnesia that Baghulizadeh describes in her work. Although enslavement was only formally abolished in Iran in 1929, Iranians today popularly deny any history of slavery while still carrying anti-black attitudes embedded in everyday culture. The erasure of the institution resulted in the erasure of the people who descended from it. The Afro-Iranian community today is concentrated primarily in the southern provinces of Hormozgan, Sistan, and Balochistan, Bushehr, Khuzestan, and Fars, provinces that hug the Persian Gulf Coast and have historically been the most economically neglected parts of the country. They refer to themselves in various ways, often using the Persian word Sia, meaning black, though activists have spent years working to reclaim that term from its negative connotations and transform it into a source of pride. Others use the term Bambasi. Many, particularly in Sistan and Balochistan, speak Baluchi as their primary language. Those in Hormozgan speak a dialect called Bandari. Most identify as Shia Muslims, which is itself a marker of the deep integration that occurred over centuries of coexistence with the broader Iranian population. That cultural integration is genuine and runs deep. Afro-Iranians have contributed significantly to Iranian music, and the most visible expression of that contribution is Bandari music and dance, a genre that is beloved across Iran and widely recognized as among the most joyful and energetic of all Iranian musical forms. What most Iranians who dance to Bandari music do not know, or do not acknowledge, is that its roots lie in African spiritual traditions brought to the Persian Gulf Coast by enslaved people. The genre is inseparable from a practice called Gwati, the belief that dancing has healing properties, which traveled from East Africa to Iran through exactly the same route as the people who carried it. Another survival from that African spiritual heritage is the Zar ritual, a healing ceremony involving songs and dances believed to exorcise malignant spirits, still practiced today in Iran's southern coastal communities and recognizably related to similar ceremonies found in Tanzania, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. These are not marginal folk practices. They are living evidence of a connection between Iran and Africa that the country's dominant national narrative refuses to tell. The dominant narrative is built on what researchers call the Aryan myth, a framework of Iranian national identity that traces Persian civilization back to an ancient and ethnically distinct people and implicitly erases or subordinates everything that does not fit that lineage. That myth, which was cultivated aggressively during the Pahlavi dynasty and has never been fully dismantled, has been the single most powerful structural force keeping the Afro-Iranian community out of the national story. It is what allows most Iranians to believe, sincerely and without malice, that Iran was never a slave society. It is what leads many people to assume when they encounter a black Iranian on the streets of Bandar Abbas or Qashem Island, that the person must have come from somewhere else. And then there is Haji Firuz. Every year, in the days leading up to Nowruz, the Persian New Year, a minstrel figure appears in the streets of every Iranian city. He wears bright red clothing, plays a tambourine, dances, sings, and his face is painted entirely black. He is called Haji Firuz, and he is one of the most beloved characters in Iranian popular culture. The songs he sings are addressed directly to his master, whom he implores to be happy. The lyrics translate, in part, as, "My master, hold your head up high. My master, look at yourself." The scholars who have studied him most carefully, including Baghulizadeh and literary scholar Parisa Vazier, have concluded that Haji Firuz is a direct descendant of the Iranian blackface performance tradition known as siyabazi, meaning black play, which was rooted in the portrayal of enslaved African servants in Qajarira household entertainment. His blackened face, his red servant's clothes, his deferential songs to his master, his role as an entertainer who makes the wealthy laugh while he himself is kept poor. All of it traces a direct line back to the lived reality of enslaved Africans in Iranian aristocratic households. Tehran's municipality has at various points acknowledged the controversy and called for research and public debate. But Haji Firuz continues to appear every Nowruz, and the debate over his origins continues to follow a familiar pattern. The majority of Iranians dismiss the criticism as Western overreach or cultural misunderstanding, arguing that the blackened face refers to soot from Nowruz fires and has nothing to do with race, while the Afro-Iranian community and the scholars who study this history point out that those explanations were constructed relatively recently and specifically in response to political pressure, not rooted in any documented historical account that predates the controversy. For Afro-Iranians themselves, Haji Firuz is not primarily an academic debate. It is the experience of watching the most visible black figure in their country's popular culture be a dancing servant who calls his Persian master lord and exists solely to make other people happy. It is a symbol of how thoroughly the country has managed to celebrate a black presence in its culture while simultaneously denying that presents any dignity, history, or personhood. The daily experience of being black in Iran sits on top of all of this historical weight. The Afro-Iranian community has no formal legal recognition as a distinct ethnic minority under Iranian law. The provinces they predominantly inhabit are among the most impoverished in the country, with Sistan and Balochistan consistently recording among the highest poverty rates of any Iranian province, with the vast majority of its population living below the national poverty line, according to UN human rights experts. Persian remains the sole language of instruction in Iranian schools despite the country's enormous linguistic diversity, meaning that Afro-Iranian children whose home language is Bandari or Baluchi enter an educational system that treats their native tongue as irrelevant. Access to employment, housing, and political representation follows the same pattern of structural disadvantage that characterizes the position of ethnic minorities across Iran more broadly. What makes the Afro-Iranian situation uniquely difficult is that it is invisible, even within the broader conversation about minority rights in Iran. The UN, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International have documented discrimination against Kurds, Baloch, Arabs, Azerbaijanis, and Turkmens in Iran. Those communities at least appear by name in international human rights reports. The Afro-Iranian community is so thoroughly erased from the national narrative that it rarely registers even in the documentation of Iranian human rights violations, because most observers, do not know it exists. The people working to change that are doing so largely from outside Iran. The Collective for Black Iranians, founded by a group of Black and Afro-Iranian intellectuals and artists in the diaspora, including members based in Canada, France, the United States, and Germany, has spent years using storytelling, film, music, and social media to make the community visible to a global audience. By 2021, the collective had built an audience of over 20,000 followers across the world and had been featured in Al Jazeera, AJ+, and The New Arab. Their multimedia exhibition Hastim, which means we are here in Persian, debuted in Philadelphia in 2021 and took its title from exactly the statement that the Iranian national narrative has spent a century refusing to make, that Black Iranians exist, that they have always existed, and that their presence in the country's history and culture is not an asterisk but a chapter. Activist Alex Eskandakar, one of the collective's founding voices, has spent years working to reverse the negative connotations attached to the word Sia and reclaim it as a term of affirmation and pride. What he and the other members of the collective are confronting is not simply prejudice. They are confronting a state-level erasure that was implemented deliberately and has been maintained consistently for nearly a century, one that took a community of people descended from enslaved Africans, integrated them into the cultural and economic fabric of the country, took their music and their spiritual traditions and their labor, and then refused to acknowledge that they were there. That refusal has a specific cost that goes beyond the symbolic. When a society denies that a group of people have a history worth knowing, it also denies those people the standing to make claims based on that history. The Afro-Iranian community cannot point to centuries of documented presence in Iran and say that this history entitles them to recognition, protection, or redress, because the centuries of documented presence have been erased from the official record. They are, in the assessment of the collective's own framing, a community that exists everywhere in Iranian culture and nowhere in the Iranian state's account of itself. Iran's government has, with studied irony, spent considerable energy positioning itself as a champion of black rights globally. The supreme leader has tweeted about racial discrimination in the United States on Martin Luther King Day. Iranian state media has covered the Black Lives Matter movement extensively and sympathetically. The Islamic Republic has fashioned itself, since 1979, as a leader of anti-imperialist movements for the global South, including the African continent. What the government has never done is apply any of that language to the black community living in its own southern provinces, the descendants of people who were enslaved and transported there by Iranian masters over the course of a millennium. That contradiction is the most precise summary of what the Afro-Iranian community is up against. Not a country that denies the existence of racism in principle, but a country that condemns racism loudly in every direction except the one that would require it to look at itself. The Collective for Black Iranians chose their name carefully and their exhibition title even more so. Hustish. We are here. It is the simplest possible statement, and in Iran it is still a radical one.